Chapter 20, Part 2, Fighting the War. Once the United States declared war, getting troops to the front lines was something else. You remember early 20th century transportation was in a whole different state than it is today, so it's going to take some time to draft, to train, to equip, and then to transport troops to the trenches in France. So it's not going to be until 1918 that Americans in any numbers are going to be on the front lines fighting with the Allies. American troops are going to be led by John Pershing, better known as Black Jack Pershing. He's going to command the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force in Europe. And again, fight major battles only by 1918, almost a year after the declaration of war is made in the spring of 1917. And even though this is late in the war that Americans arrive in Europe, and even though we're not talking about as large a number of troops certainly as fight in the other Allied armies or Central Power armies, the arrival of American troops at such a critical time in the war, after so many years of such attrition, so many deaths on both sides, will make a critical difference in the war and will turn the tide of this war in favor of the Allies, defeating the Central Powers. The crucial role that American troops will play is really that of reinforcements or replacements for the horrendous losses that the English and the French have faced in the trenches. And you can see here on the screen a photo of the trenches. There are some others in your text, and there are lots of great web resources about the trench warfare in Europe in World War I. One is from PBS, a documentary called The Great War. You can just Google PBS, The Great War, and you'll find it. Lots of great video, even from film of actual war scenes. Stories from survivors of the war, from the troops themselves, about problems like illness, damp trenches, rats, poison gas attacks, lice, just all the hardships that troops would face in the field. Recently, the book and the movie based on the book War Horse has been a popular film that you may have seen that also really well illustrates the conditions in France and the trenches. And in this time, remember that even though some modern weapons of war are being used, it is still a time when horses are used not just for the troops themselves, not just as part of the cavalry, but are also used, remember, to actually transport ambulances, to transport equipment, and to transport even the big guns of the era. So the bodies of horses and the problem of horses and livestock is a big problem in this war. So if you haven't seen War Horse or seen the play War Horse, I would encourage you to do that as a way of getting some idea of what this war was like on the ground. Now here's a great map from your text that shows you some locations of major battles in which Americans were involved. You saw a map of a photo of the Argonne Forest, and again you see other locations here on the Western Front. American troops are here on the Western Front, and you can see the trench lines and how the trench lines are drawn here in France, and you can see the final armistice line. And just point this out because you notice it's not in Germany. You notice that the German forces, the Central Powers, were never driven back into Germany by the time of the surrender for the armistice. An armistice means a ceasefire. So the Germans never agreed to total surrender. They agreed to an armistice on which to negotiate a peace settlement. Because by the time the Americans come into the war and change the direction of this war, you can see push this trench line back toward Germany. It is clear that the Germans are going to lose this war if they continue to fight. So they, in essence, sue for peace to get the best deal they can get at this point. And of course, as I'm recording this, it is actually Veterans Day, which is November the 11th. And this is Veterans Day today for us. We celebrate it, but historically it was known as Armistice Day because it was the day on which World War I ended. November the 11th at 11 o'clock in the morning was the exact time of the end of World War I. 1918. Now, an interesting part of the history of World War I that's gaining a lot more attention by historians is the flu pandemic. It was called the Spanish flu at the time because of the mistaken belief that the flu came from Spain. But in actuality, we now know it came from the United States. So the flu began in the United States and then spread because of the war all over the world. Because as troops came from the United States into the war, of course they came in contact with soldiers not only from all the Allied nations but from the Central Power nations, and this spread the flu pandemic. The flu pandemic would take many more lives than the war itself. The war would take about 16 million lives worldwide, but the best estimate that we have is that the flu pandemic would take at least 50 million lives worldwide. And you see the stats on the screen that of the 112,000 Americans that died in World War I, at least half of them died of the flu, not of combat, but died of the flu. So back home in the United States, over 600,000 Americans would die of the flu. And there are many good documentaries and books written about this. The Great Pandemic is one of the best. And you can go again to Google and just Google the flu pandemic of 1918, and you'll find these resources from PBS's The American Experience, Influenza, 1918, to any of these other titles. Of Great Pandemic, 1918 is a government site, and you can see photographs like these that I have on the screen. You can see testimony from survivors about what it was like, and read stories about how in the United States even, which was by 1918, 1919, a very modern industrialized nation with a modern transportation network, but you can read how all of our public health systems were completely overwhelmed by this pandemic. When over 600,000 Americans died out of a population that was not anywhere close to 200 million, you can imagine that not only do the hospitals get overwhelmed, but the mortuaries get overwhelmed. And in fact, oftentimes bodies had to be buried in mass graves in order to protect the public health. And this is a situation in which today, if it were to occur, we would be looking at deaths in the millions, not in the thousands. And so the fear is always that this sort of pandemic could strike. In fact, this was a bird flu type pandemic, and we have seen strains similar to this pandemic reoccur. Not ever with the virulence, not with the deadliness of this pandemic, but this is one that is studied, this flu strain studied, the DNA preserved and studied to the present. So the flu actually is the biggest killer worldwide, much larger in importance in terms of taking human life than the war. So this is an interesting facet of what happens when wars occur. Oftentimes there are killers like disease that take on a whole new, of course, importance. So this is an interesting part of the story. I'm going to stop here with the second part and record a short third part on the peace treaty.